Let's talk Resident Evil 2. I've already covered RE1 on this channel, and I plan on covering all the Resident Evils eventually. And I've covered the RE3 remake on this channel, actually, which was a very different style than these, so I may be recovering that again in this style at some point. I know that not everybody is here for the more conversational type of videos, but these are what we are doing on this channel now. I don't have the time to sit down and edit like I used to, so I still want to talk about video games. We are still going to do so and continue talking about video games over here. So we talked about Resident Evil 1, and one of the big points of interest for me in that game was whether or not it was worth it to play the original version of Resident Evil 1 after you had a chance to play the remake. And the conclusion I came to in that game was that for the novelty of the game, sure, it's fine. But is there a reason to really play it outside of that novelty factor? Not really. The remake is an infinitely better realized game, and if you want to play that original experience, it can be played just as well on a Nintendo DS, and it's probably better on the Nintendo DS, to be honest. At least that's what I came to. That's the conclusion I came to. I also want to note that Resident Evil 2 is a bit of a different game than the first one. It may be, functionally, the exact same controls and setups and everything, but this game has a much more involved, more realized story, a more realized soundtrack. You actually can hear it in the background. I say right now, but it's at that point that we're transmitting to another track, so it was right now until the music track screwed me. There we go. Now, the music for this game is actually something that you can also hear in the remake, but you have to actually buy a special DLC to make that happen. Temp of the Nurse, thank you very much for redeeming your points for an owl. Owl. Now, as much as this is a game, first and foremost, I want to talk about the story first before we do anything else here. So let's go ahead and talk about that. The beginning of the game sees you as either Leon or Claire coming into Raccoon City. If you're Claire, you are coming looking for your lost brother Chris, but if you're Leon, you are coming for effectively your first day on the force as a police officer. Now, this gets redone a little bit in the remake. Claire's story stays the same, but in the remake, Leon's is shifted a little bit to where he wasn't supposed to come in at all. He was told not to, but he decided to come in anyway because he is Resident Evil's golden boy after all. So the story's a bit changed in the remake, but we're going to stick to the original as best we can here. Upon coming into Raccoon City and meeting each other, they realize that the entire city is basically under the effects of a zombie apocalypse. This is really only believable when you take into account that neither of them are actually residents of the city proper. They are commuting from outside suburbs, which have not been affected by this panic and outbreak quite yet. And the reason why it hasn't been affected yet actually is explained in the games. For those who sit down and read all of the different documents in Resident Evil 2, it's actually explicitly said that Chief Brian Irons tried to bar all access in and out of his city. The Umbrella Corporation wanted him to do this as a method of quarantine, but he did it because he's, quite frankly, a vengeful piece of shit, and he wanted everybody in the city to die because the Umbrella Corporation stopped paying him lots of money. I wish I was kidding. But, so you get to Raccoon City, you see that it's under the effects of the zombie apocalypse, and once you realize that Raccoon City is not in the best of states. Also, sorry for having to see me click ahead. There are some times where I AFK in the gameplay footage, and it's just still there. But you realize upon coming to Raccoon City that you need to go to a safe haven. Leon, being the, we'll go ahead and say, naive golden boy that he is, believes that the best way to accomplish this is for you to run your happy ass into the Raccoon City Police Department. Because that is where the police officers will have been. That is where all of the guns have been. That is where he was supposed to be in the first place. To him, that is a place of safety. Now, what you find when you get to the police station is that it's actually overrun by not only zombies, but also monsters. So, the police station is not safe. But why was the police station not safe? Well, we got to talk about Chief Brian Irons again. It turns out that part of his efforts to screw over Raccoon City involved hiding all of the guns, ammunition, and medical supplies around the police station. Now, from a gameplay perspective, this makes perfect sense. Having an in-story reason as to why your armaments are not all in a central location, in a place that normally would have them all in a central location, makes sense. And the reason that Brian Irons does this to himself is to fuck over the police force. He wants them all to die. He wants everybody in Raccoon City to die, quite frankly. But the reason that is given to the police force is scattering the munitions is done in an effort to curb potential terroristic threats. Now, what you find during the actual course of the game is that the terroristic threats have also been engineered by Chief Irons. Literally, all of this is engineered by them. Brian Irons is not the greatest person in the world, is what I'm saying. Let's go ahead and talk about him as a villain, though. Let's focus on him before we get back to the on-running story. Brian's, of course, not the only villain in this game. You've got Brian, you've got Birkin, and the Umbrella Corporation at large. Umbrella, you feel the effects of what they do throughout the game at all times. Birkin is kind of a mindless force who you hear about, and you ultimately end up having to confront. Brian Irons, on the other hand, you get a lot of information on this guy. You get information from his secretary, where in her diaries you find out the various ways in which he was abusive towards her and others as they tried to unravel things that he was doing in the police station to begin with. The effects of this can be felt not only in the scattering of the munitions, but the manic ways in which he has set up the actual police station itself. There is some weird-ass artwork here that he has purchased with his funds from the Umbrella Corporation, and they give you some good insight into the type of person he is. Now, a bit of a trigger warning for sexual assault, but we also find during the course of the game that Chief Brian Irons was also a twice accused or at least a several times accused rapist. Now, because of his outstanding performance in the realm of academia, he was let off the hook and allowed to gain a position of power. That's honestly more of a relatable thing for a lot of people when they know that their bosses, employers, or even politicians are actually not the best people underneath that veneer of protecting and serving. And as much as it sucks to take into consideration that this is a thing that happens in reality, in Resident Evil, this is just one of the three major villains of the story. So the ones who impact you the most personally are definitely Brian Irons, though you'll only really encounter him, if memory serves, if you play as Claire. When you're playing as Leon, you generally don't encounter him that much, as far as I remember. Now, Leon does end up dealing with Birkin more, but again, Birkin doesn't have any personal confrontations with you as a person, only as a monster. And that matters because, well, the only person who Birkin is a person to is Annette Birkin, his wife, who plays sort of an anti-villain role here. Anti-hero role. She's not a bad person per se, but she's certainly on the wrong side of history throughout the course of the game. And she doesn't really do the best job when it comes to you as either Leon or Claire. She's certainly more friendly towards Claire than Leon, because during Leon's campaign, you meet the other anti-hero of this story, Ada Wong. Ada is effectively a double and or triple agent, depending on the game you're playing, who is working for either a combination of Umbrella, Wesker independently, or other random shadowy organizations. It, again, really depends on the game you happen to be playing. Ada is always on her own side, and she lies to everyone. As you play through the game's story, if you're playing as Claire, you will interact more with Sherry Birkin, which will give you those more positive outcomes with Annette Birkin. As you play as Leon, you are playing with Ada, mainly, as your secondary character. And the problem with that is, well, Annette Birkin knows who Ada is. She knows Ada is out for her own self, and knows that Ada will shoot her at a moment's notice if it means getting a sample of the G virus, which we haven't talked about yet. So let's go ahead and get back to the story that we see in the game itself. You arrive at the police station. you meet a man named Marvin who tells you what happened there, and you slowly piece together what happened at this police station with these disparate forces of Birkin, the Umbrella Corporation, and Chief Brian Irons by grabbing various notes and pieces along the way. These give you the insight and information as to what happened here. This is one of my favorite types of storytelling in a game. Whenever a game decides that it wants to actually hide a lot of its story, and you have to go and find it. This is one of the things that I found fascinating about playing the Metroid Prime games, because it did a lot of the same stuff. And honestly, I am thrilled to go back through games that are more interested in having a good story to tell, but not shoving that story down your throat for people who want to experience the gameplay more. Though if you skip most of those notes, you'll still get a pretty decent story, though it's admittedly a little bare bones without the extra fleshing out that the notes give you. The notes even tell you, like, detailed diaries of background characters, and through learning about what they went through, you find out the psychological breakdown of various characters in Raccoon City, down to the point where some of them even commit suicide. Now, I played this game as a kid. This was one of the first times I ever encountered suicide as a concept in media at all. I had a really religious upbringing, and it was just not one of those things that you talked about ever at all, despite me having a family member who had actually done it. Speaking of Marvin, well, when you meet him, he is bit, and he tries to force you away from him because, well, as you can see on screen, he's not really long for this world. Now, you spend more time with Marvin in the remake than you do in this version of the game, but that's largely immaterial. We're here just to watch Marvin eat Claire. Anywho, point is, as you discover things in the facility, which, should just be a police station, you find a couple of bits of information. One, the police station used to be a museum before it ever became a police station. It was converted, and as such, Chief Brian Irons had lots of places to hang all of his gaudy artwork. The artwork that, again, gives you really good insight into his personal character traits. You also find out that the Umbrella Corporation has a secret lab, and that lab is hidden under the police station. Now, why is it able to be hidden under the police station? Well, remember, it was a museum first and foremost. So as opposed to being a building that was built on top of regular rock, gravel, and everything, there were long storage containers, or long storage units, under the actual police station itself, back when it was a museum. These end up being used as go-between areas so that you can get down into the sewer system, which connects into Umbrella's secret facilities. Now, these sewer system areas are expanded on a lot in the remake, but we're not talking about the remake right now. We are talking about the original. There's not that much down there aside from a couple of entryways until you get to the actual Umbrella facilities. And I'm going to be honest, those facilities, let's go ahead and skip ahead to where they are. These are the sewer systems. Once you actually get to the facilities themselves and get done reading a couple of notes here, because apparently I have a lot of note reading. There we go. These are your sewers. This is your thoroughway into the actual facilities themselves. You don't spend a whole lot of time down here, but there's a stark contrast in the way that these areas are set up compared to the police station. Whereas the police station felt a little more open, these areas are infinitely more claustrophobic. Now, this is all about how the areas feel. In practice, all areas in Resident Evil 2 are claustrophobic. I'd argue there's more open areas in the original Resident Evil than there are in this game. Old school Resident Evils are really a series of hallways meant to back you into a corner, so you have to make tough choices over what enemies you're going to be fighting. But as you explore through this facility, you have to come to terms with the fact that William Birkin, one of those forces I mentioned before, has been infected by the G-Virus, because Umbrella has come to take the G-Virus from him so that they can sell it on the black market. Or at the very least, sell the bioweapons they are creating in these underground facilities on the black market. William Birkin injects himself with the G-Virus in order to survive the attack, and ends up turning himself into a monster. This monster kills all but one person who was charged with taking the G-Virus from him. you find that the actual reason that the entire city got infected in the first place was because Birkin infected himself. After infecting himself, he attacked the unit that tried to kill him. In so doing, he destroyed several vials of the G virus, leaving them to contaminate the local sewers, which means that sewer rats got contaminated. And if you know anything about how the Black Plague was spread, well, let's just go ahead and say that humanity does not have a great track record when it comes to plague rats. Also, hi, Memory Martin. Thank you for the congratulations. So, after you find out how this all happens, there's really not that much of the game's story left. You have to track down William Birkin, and depending on which side of the story you're on, you are either Leon, trying to help Ada escape with her sample of the G-Virus, or you are Claire, trying to save Sherry Birkin from, let's go ahead and call it what it is, and trigger warning for incest. She's been impregnated by her father, and that is the exact words that the original version of the game uses to describe what happens to her. You see, unlike the T-Virus, which just creates mutagenic bioweapons, the G-Virus wants to replicate itself. It is one of the imperatives of the virus that makes it supposedly an improvement over the T-Virus. There's just a problem, though. Much like how the T-Virus could only properly bond onto people with very particular sets of DNA, to the point where only 1 out of 50 people in the population could turn into a tyrant with the T-Virus, in Resident Evil 2, it's found that the G-Virus can only replicate itself if the person who's been infected with the G-Virus implants and impregnates someone with the same DNA as them. Which, of course, means that close family are the only ones here. Resident Evil 2 definitely keeps things very Alabama. And it's very disturbing, especially to think that this is a concept that is tackled in a survival horror game, of all things, on the early PlayStation. But it is in fact what happens, and as Claire, you have to synthesize a vaccine that will allow Sherry to survive the ordeal, because otherwise she will turn into a monster just like William Birkin. And again, this is something that Annette Birkin points out to you, Sherry's mother. I'm not trying to be deliberately triggering or be, deliberately obtuse or even just disgusting when I say what happens to Sherry in this game. I'm just being honest about what the game shows to you. Now, don't get it wrong. You do end up saving Sherry's life, and by the time you get to Resident Evil 6, you'll see that when she grows up to be an adult, she has gained some quite interesting powers as a result of this ordeal. Not the greatest thing to constantly have a reminder of what happened to you as a child, but it is at least there in the very least, and it is acknowledged by the story going forward. Now, at the end of this game, you find out that the facility that you're in is going to be destroyed because Umbrella has rigged every facility they ever make with self-destruct devices, so the evidence cannot be found. Now, it's supposed to be that people are able to escape these facilities when they self-destruct, but that's not exactly the reality that happens here. Not everybody really gets to escape. But you do manage to escape on a train with Leon after dealing with the threat of Brian Irons, who dies to the G-Virus, William Birkin, who, well, mutates into a giant monster and tries to consume the train and gets beat down by a rocket launcher. You escape the city, and you decide that you're going to try to take down the Umbrella Corporation, which, of course, you don't do. You don't actually get to see them get taken down until the events of Umbrella Chronicles and Resident Evil 4. But until that happens, we know that the Umbrella Corporation will continue to do shitty things here. Now, one day after the events of Raccoon City, or a couple days after the events of Raccoon City, the city gets nuked during the events of Resident Evil 3. But that's going to be a story for when we tackle the original version of RE3. With the story concluded, let's go ahead and talk about the actual game itself. I personally rather like the story, despite the strange and sometimes very repulsive things that happen to the characters in it. I still find it to be a very compelling tale, to the point where I actually own the novelization of the game and have read it several times, even growing up. keep talking, everyone gets to escape. Let's talk about that gameplay, though. As you've noticed on screen, the gameplay takes place in a series of pre-rendered environments. This means that you are not actually walking on a 3D plane. You are walking on what is effectively a two-dimensional picture at any given time. This was due to the limitations on the actual hardware the game came out in, the original PlayStation. Now, there's another wonderful story where these limitations are concerned about how this game got ported to the Nintendo 64. That's not a story for today, though. That is for a completely different day. But the game has its limitations. This is also an early attempt at 3D, and there was something that a lot of early games did back then, and that is tank controls. Now, tank controls means that when you press forward on your joystick, you get to walk forward. But when you press left and right, you don't go left or right, you simply turn around in a circle. Now, you can go diagonally, but it's very finicky. And you'll find yourself when playing through this game, unless you're a speedrunner, hanging yourself on walls a lot for guidance. It's what I do, and I've been playing this game for years. As you'll notice in my gameplay, most of my time I'm actually latched onto a wall. Literally seeing it right now. These are things that you end up doing to adapt to the control scheme in the game. And as awkward as they are to manhandle, it is a thing that you get used to. Now, one of the benefits of a control scheme like this is that it does lower your maneuverability and power. In the Resident Evil 1 remake, there is a version of the controls you can use that give you full analog movement instead of tank controls, and it drastically lowers the difficulty of that game. I kind of prefer the game with the higher difficulty because it is a survival horror game the first time around. And all good Resident Evils are survival horror games the first time, and arcade games the second. Now, there's one other thing that is birthed from these gameplay choices, and that is the camera angles. Because you only have the individual camera angles to work with, because they are all 2D pictures that you are running across, this gives the game a benefit that it otherwise wouldn't have. And that is that, much like in a movie, a cinematographer can choose the exact angle at any given point that they want you to see for any particular scene. It's not the same thing as in a regular 3D game when you're having over-the-shoulder perspective, and you can zoom in on things and look at details all you want. You get the director's perspective, and only the director's perspective. Now, whether or not you think that's good, bad, or could be improved on in another iteration, that's entirely up to personal preference. I think that gameplay is generally better without something like this, but story and presentation are greatly improved by something like this. So I guess you just figure out where you prefer to dial that down. As a survival horror game, though, presentation and experience sometimes are more important than the actual gameplay itself, because that experience is important. And as you're adapting to these gameplay limitations, well, you'll end up getting better at them anyway. Because again, the second time through, this will be more of an arcade game, where you're trying to best your times, and you're trying to do things as quick as possible. You can go through one of these games in a couple of hours without even using any speedrun strategies, merely by mapping out where you're going as better than the first time you went through. And now that you know where everything is, it shouldn't be anywhere near as scary. But let's talk about another thing that this game does. It's a bit of an improvement over the first. Your arsenal. In the first Resident Evil game, you got access to a grenade launcher, you got access to a shotgun, a pistol, and a magnum. And throughout most of the game outside of the knife, that's what you'd be using. In this game, a lot of improvements have been made for you. You have access to your pistol, like in the first one, but you also have access to a shotgun and a crossbow, depending on which character's campaign you're going through. The grenade launcher works kind of roughly the same-ish as it did before. I'd say that the grenade launcher grenades actually fall a little faster in this one than in other ones. But you also gain access to percentage-based weapons. Weapons that you can fire, and then when they run out of ammo, they're basically disposable. This is something new to this game that was not in the original. And speaking of those weapons, we got to talk about the inventory here. Largely, the inventory system is the same as in the first one. You have 8 inventory slots available to you at any given time, and you have to try to make sure that you're carrying the right amount of healing items, keys, and weaponry to survive, and that can sometimes be a hard thing to juggle. If you have a knife for when you run out of ammo, a pistol for small threats, and, say, a shotgun for large threats, and the ammo for each, that's 5 of your inventory slots taken altogether. Add in a couple of healing items as just in case, and you've now got 1 inventory slot. And if you have a puzzle that requires you to use multiple inventory slots, then you're screwed, unless you want to either backtrack or use more healing items than you really should. Now, is this a detriment to the gameplay? From my perspective, no. Yes, backtracking is a pain in the ass, but in this game, it's on you to prepare correctly. You can walk around with only a single weapon if you're willing to be very sparse with your ammunition. And this game actually makes it very easy to do so. During this last playthrough, I did something that I really haven't done before, and I accidentally ran out of ammo. And I was spending a good portion of my first hour running around with 0 bullets and no healing items. And I learned how to make very liberal use of my knife. This is a skill that I've actually taken into my Resident Evil 3 playthrough as well. But normally, I put my knife completely away in a playthrough of a Resident Evil game. I decided to try using the knife more here, and I learned how to actually use it a little better. Now, granted, if there's more than one enemy in a room, or you're dealing with something that is not a bog-standard zombie, you really don't want to be just using that knife. There are speedrunners who can. I don't think you want to be doing that. But gameplay-wise, there are more options given to you in this game than in the original. And I actually appreciate that. This game leans a little more into the action than it does in the first one. For instance, in the first Resident Evil game, you would fight zombies 1 or 2 at a time, or maybe a hunter at a time. In this game, enemies come down in groups of 5 and 6 sometimes in various areas. Now, this does mean that the polygon count of the individual enemies is lower than in the original, but that's fine. The gameplay doesn't suffer for it. Effectively, these enemy hordes are just ways of making sure that you run out of ammo quicker so that you're having to deal in desperate straits more often, because this is a survival horror game. And honestly, for my take, that's perfectly fine. The game wants you to feel underpowered. The game wants you to feel scared. The game wants you to feel like you're backed into a corner. So it makes scenarios get constructed in such a way that you will be backed into those corners. And yeah, just knife speedrunners in Resident Evil do scare me as well. Now, when it comes to boss battles in this game, that's probably the one place that I think this game suffers. Whereas individual enemy encounters can be tackled in a variety of ways, boss encounters get tackled basically the exact same way. Fire at the boss, run away, fire again, and run away. It isn't until encounters like, say, the Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 that boss encounters really take a step up in their difficulty or even in the strategies employed to actually handle them. But we'll get to that when we get to RE3. But that would be my one complaint here. I'm not going to put an actual arbitrary number on gameplay, story, or anything like that, but I think that I would say that this is definitely a game worth revisiting. Now let's go ahead and compare this to the remake. I'll do a separate video on the remake when I get to it, but is this game worth playing with the Resident Evil 2 remake being a thing? And I think it is, because there's a couple things I haven't mentioned that are literally absent in that remake. So, in the remake, you constantly fight against a presence called Mr. X. He's always there no matter what you do. In the original, Mr. X is only in Scenario B, and that Scenario B has a lot more going on than in the remake. You see, when you finish Scenario A for a character, you automatically unlock the Scenario B for the opposite character. The idea is that you are playing through 2 stories in the same game that are taking place simultaneously. If you do Scenario A for both characters, they'll feel largely similar to one another, and it's not really the 2 stories don't line up correctly. But with Scenario A and B, they actually do. But there's something else this game does with its scenarios that I adore, and it's the zapping system. You see, various items that you pick up in your first playthrough will actually be missing in your second playthrough, because again, these are playthroughs that were supposed to take place at the exact same time. If you took something with your first character, it is assumed that in the canon playthrough for the second character, that item is also missing. There's actually one area in specific that I want to talk about where you are presented with the option of getting a submachine gun, one of those percentage-based items that will be discarded once you use it, but has a lot of firepower. In fact, I'm using it here near the end of the game because, well, I save it for this moment. Or an item pouch, giving you 2 more item slots, which is one of the most useful things for you to have in any Resident Evil game. Inventory space is paramount in all of the early entries to this game. Every little bit of inventory space that you can gain is important. 2 inventory slots means I can have 2 extra types of grenades for the grenade launcher. It means I can carry 2 extra healing items. It means I can be more liberal with the items I carry with me so that I can grab puzzle pieces for other puzzles while I'm walking around instead of having to stop and move into a puzzle mode from, say, a combat mode. But the game presents you with the choice. Which of these do you want to take? And if you take one, then the other will be available in the next playthrough. If you take both, well, then you're fucked. Likewise, if you collect a particular item from the stars room as your main character, that item will not be available when you go into your second playthrough. For me as Claire, this was the grenade launcher, and this will change the way the game is played during your second playthrough. This is a feature that is completely missing from the remake. Not only that, but the remake adopts an over-the-shoulder perspective, which gives a completely different, unique take on your experience in the mansion, or not in the mansion, but in the police station and the underground facilities. The fixed camera perspective that is in the Resident Evil 1 remake is completely missing from the remake that we have of RE2. Now again, is the over-the-shoulder perspective an improvement for gameplay? Most certainly. But when it comes to presentation and cinematography, again, there's more you can do with that original setup. I think both games are worth playing, and I especially think both are worth playing back-to-back because they give very unique experiences to the player. In the original, you'll be playing a by-the-book survival horror that has the idea that you're going to be playing through multiple playthroughs, and it adjusts itself according to those playthroughs. In the remake, you'll be playing a much more scary survival horror game, to be sure, and a game that will ask a lot more from you mechanically as a player. But at the end of the day, it is a very different experience, especially since, in my opinion, the remake has a very neutered Scenario B in comparison to what we get in the original. Now, the remake does much better with Mr. X. He is almost a throwaway in the original game. He only appears in Scenario B, and he only appears in scripted encounters as opposed to being an ever-present threat. I prefer the ever-present Mr. X, personally. But, with that said, would I recommend playing this game? Abso-fucking-lutely. 110%. This game has an amazing trio of villains between the Umbrella Corporation, William Birkin, and Chief Brian Irons as the actual standout of this game for me. Birkin was the standout for me as a kid. Big, imposing monster I fight in boss battles. Now, honestly, Brian Irons is my standout villain. Because villains that make me scared for what humanity is are infinitely more terrifying to me than the biggest monsters that can ever be presented to me. And the Brian Irons we see in the original is much more explicitly a predator than the Brian Irons we see in the remake. Oh, he's a predator in that one too, don't get me wrong. But the things we hear about him are much more verbose in the original. Now, as far as gameplay, there are some adjustments you'll need to make when playing this game. Would I recommend playing the original PlayStation version of it? Probably not. As good of a game as it is, even on the original PlayStation, I actually think this game plays a little better for me in the N64 version, and especially in the GameCube re-release of this game. For one, the games give you a few more ink ribbons, but for two, the graphics are polished up a little bit, and quite frankly, it's more convenient to have everything on a single disc. There aren't any other notable remakes of the game that I can think of that I would recommend, though there is a good version on the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast version of this game uniquely has the VMU unit, which, if you're playing, lets you actually see the health of your character, which is something the game does not show to you normally. Normally, that is something you have to kind of perceive unless you're in a pause menu. Whichever version of the game you decide to pick up, though, will be a worthwhile experience for you. This is a fantastic piece of gaming history, and it is a wonderful experience even now. Now, granted, it certainly has aged, but I'd say it's aged a lot more gracefully than the original Resident Evil has, in my personal opinion. This has a soundtrack that I can still listen to today, and I still put onto my version of the remake that I play as well. In the sound department, the game is stellar. In the gameplay department, the game is a survival horror, so the gameplay is going to be neutered for you. It's not bad, but it's trying to underpower you. Keep that in mind. And as I said, from a story perspective, this is a story that everybody should be able to experience at least once. It is a phenomenal piece of gaming history, and I think everybody should have an opportunity to give it a shot if you haven't already. But with that said, I want to know what you think of Resident Evil 2. This is one of my favorite pieces of gaming history, and it is one of the games that I grew up with. Strangely, I started on the Resident Evil 1 remake, and then played RE2 on the N64, and had to wrap my head around the fact that the sequel came out on an earlier system, because I didn't know that the game was originally a PlayStation game. But that's a personal story, and not part of this particular review. But I want to know your personal stories in the comment section below. That's the area to let me know what your experiences are of this game. And if you haven't experienced it yet, are you going to give it a shot? That's something that I want to know. With that said, if you want to support my channel and what I do, there's plenty of ways to do so, including Patreon, Ko-fi, and even a merch shop. All the links to that should be in the description below. But with all that said, let me know what you think of the game. Let me know your thought of the video. And as always, everyone, instant end of video tagline here.
Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. If you want access to behind-the-scenes content for the channel, please consider checking out my Patreon. I do weekly vlogs over there, where I give real-life updates to what's going on behind the scenes on the channel, stuff that you don't really get over here, and even on Twitch. Patreon also helps the channel's stability a whole lot. Without Patreon, I wouldn't be able to do this at all. Especially with the kind of content that I do, neither YouTube nor Twitch are the most stable sources of income. If you are a $20 and up patron, then you will be featured on the ending slides as shown in the beginning of the end credits. If you want to catch the streams where all this content comes from, then consider heading over to Twitch and following. And if you want to continue watching over here on YouTube, maybe consider clicking one of the end screen videos. And once again, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me over on my channel. I wouldn't be able to do literally anything that I'm doing over here on YouTube without each and every one of you. So, thank you.